Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This is a great turnout this evening. My name is Lauren Barker. I'm the Economic Development Planner for the town of Eastham, and I want to welcome you to our first of 3 public workshops for the Master Plan project. Tonight, we are joined by representatives from Union Studio. They are our lead firm on the Master Plan project, as well as representatives from Horsley Witten Group and Cape Built, and we're going to have them introduce themselves. I just wanted to take an opportunity to, again, thank you all for being here and for being involved in this process. As you all know, there's been a lot of work completed up to this point to get us to tonight, and Jeremy and team are going to go through that, and then myself and Paul Lag, our Community Development Director for the town, are here as well to answer any questions that you have and be here for support as needed. So thank you again, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeremy Lake of Union Studio. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Lauren. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. This is a great turnout. We're really excited for you guys all to be here. We've been passing around a survey. Some of you that may have just come in at the very end, it's just a very quick thing. You could even do it at the end if you want. We also have a sign-in sheet. Would be helpful if you guys haven't done that. You could also do that on the way out if you want. Just helps us understand who is here, what sort of folks showed up. When at the end I go, I think there were 20 people, and John goes, no, there were like 100 people. It helps us to really kind of figure out where we actually ended up. So very much appreciate your help with that. So why are we here tonight? So our team was hired by the town to sort of help with a visioning exercise for the couple of parcels that we're going to be talking about tonight. Just by way of show of hands, how many folks know exactly what we're talking about tonight, have been involved for a couple years now, know the lay of the land? Show your hands if you kind of feel like you're in that camp, which is a fair number of folks. How many folks tonight have no idea what we're talking about tonight, have just moved to town, saw some flyer, turned up to see what was going on? And I'm being serious. I'm trying to understand how much or how little background we need on this. So we've got a few introductory slides. I'll still go through them. I'll go through them kind of quickly because my sense is most of you have been involved, do know what's going on. We certainly don't want to keep repeating ourselves. You've been hearing some of these messages for a couple years now. So we're not here to frustrate, but we also need to be mindful of the fact that some folks might not have been all along for the ride so far. So sometimes we need to bring a few folks up to speed. So a quick outline of what we're going to cover. Obviously, it looks like a lot of points, but I don't think it'll take us too long to get through each of these things. I'm going to introduce our project team, talk a little bit about the project's history, goals, and schedule, share with you some things that we've heard in some of the first thing. The first thing we did were a couple of stakeholder sessions. That was sort of our first round of listening. You guys are our sort of second round of listening, but we'll share with you what we heard from those stakeholders. Quick touching on design standards, and when we say program elements, what we mean there is obviously for each of these sites, we're proposing housing, we're proposing open space, we're proposing a community center. We just wanted to kind of quickly talk through what those things mean generally before we start showing you the preliminary concepts. The concepts in this case, we've only just begun. We've started to cite some of those programmatic elements on the site. That's really meant to be the bread and butter of tonight's discussion. We want to get your all's input on those various concepts to help us understand which direction we might go from here. And after we talk about those 3 sites, we'll just conclude quickly with some next steps to make sure you guys are aware of what's coming down the road. So project team. So our project team, I'm with Union Studio. I'm Jeremy Lake, the name there in the middle. I'm a senior associate. The firm is about 20 years old. We're based in Providence. I've been there about 10 years. I direct most of our community design, these sorts of efforts, this kind of work. I'm excited to be joined tonight by John Ford in the back. John, if you could raise your hand, the kind gentleman passing out pens and surveys at the start of this. John is with Horsley Witten Group. Horsley Witten Group is a civil engineering firm. They're headquartered in Sandwich, Mass., but they have offices around New England. John happens to be in the Providence office, so he's really one of my neighbors. So we're excited that Horsley Witten Group is part of the team. Also joined by Rob Brennan of Cape Built Companies. Cape Built is a Cape-based developer and builder. Rob's given us a lot of great information on the ground, what's going on today. We all know construction costs are crazy. We want to make sure we've got the most up-to-date current understanding of those things as we're thinking about the feasibility of different options for these sites. And then lastly, not here tonight, but an important part of our team is Eric Bush with Peregrine Group. Peregrine Group is a real estate advisory group. He's going to help us run a lot of the pro forma numbers, a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff to make sure, again, that we're proposing something that's truly feasible and can deliver on the vision that everyone is looking for here on these sites. Project history, goals, and schedule. Again, most of you, or if not all of you, are very familiar with this, so I'm going to just do this quickly. There are 3 sites in question. The biggest one is the Tea Time parcel, which is just north of Willie's Gym, right on Route 6. the old driving range. It's what started this whole process going. Other proposals for development, folks were worried about that. The town intervened, acquired the parcel. We're now here trying to figure out what to do with it, right? In the meantime, the town also acquired the Town Center Plaza parcel, which is the one just south of that. The couple of, there's a few restaurants, there's a liquor store, there's an ice cream parlor, a real estate office that are just next to the Cumberland Farms, right? That's what we're calling the Town Center Plaza. That's also been acquired by the town and under consideration. The third parcel is the Council on Aging parcel down here in the lower right corner. The reason that we're talking about that is because one of the things that was proposed was relocating their sort of operations, their services, potentially into a new facility on the Tea Time parcel. And if we go that route, that's suddenly going to open up that building for what, right? So it's something we just want to talk about to have an understanding of, if we go that route, what would you also do with that parcel? So that's why we're considering all three of these things simultaneously. Each has very different needs, different opportunities, different constraints. So they're all going to kind of have their own personality at the end, but it all needs to work together and make sense together. As I mentioned, the town acquired the Tea Time property. That was back in 2019. They then formed the Tea Time Committee. Can I get a show of hands of how many members of the Tea Time Committee are actually here tonight? 1, 2, 3, 4. So those are the guys that are going to keep me straight through this presentation. They've put a lot of time and effort into this project already. They've gathered a lot of great public input. We're using all of the work that they've done as our starting point, which is fantastic. We're not starting from zero, we're actually starting from way into this thing, which is great. So we just get to do the fun part, which is the drawing, building on all of the knowledge and all the information that they've been gathering to date. So again, 2021, they published their recommendations. Here we are in 2022, beginning this sort of next phase, this master planning vision. Here are listed some of the project goals. This is really what the Tea Time Committee was sort of tasked with prioritizing as they thought about this. I'm not going to read the whole list, but the point is they were trying to look at this pretty comprehensively, right? It wasn't just about economic impact. It was also social impact. How can we be creative with what we do here? How can we have this be something meaningful for the existing Eastham year-round residents, right? So they had a number of marching orders, and we're continuing down that path. And the guiding principles that, again, that we're continuing to utilize as we go through this exercise: design should incorporate traditional neighborhood design while keeping the look and feel of Eastham. Design should include adequate infrastructure. We need to prioritize environmental stewardship, balance the built environment with the natural environment, and improve the quality of life for all of Eastham's residents. In terms of our project schedule, the first task, 1, pre-design, that's what we've done so far. We've been working on this now just for a few months. We've done our initial kickoff with the town, we read a bunch of the reports, and we had those stakeholder sessions that I mentioned earlier that I'm going to summarize here in a moment. That's what we've done so far, right? So now what do we still have yet ahead of us? We're now in our second task, which is coming up with some initial drafts, some initial designs, some initial estimates, and understanding the impacts of all this. And as part of this phase, we have 2 public presentations. The first one is tonight, Wednesday, May 11th, where we're going to kick this off and start getting some feedback with you guys. Then we're going to come back in a month. We're going to take all the input we hear, and we're going to start to refine things a little bit. So there'll be something much more specific the next time we come around and we talk about this. But both of those things are meant to be sort of 2 rounds of sort of slowly narrowing in on the vision for these couple of parcels. And then we will use the summer while you guys are all out laying on the beach. We're going to be working really hard to put some real solid numbers behind a lot of these things that we're talking about. And at the end of the summer, we'll provide those to the town to digest in great detail, get their final feedback, consolidate all that into a final vision, a final plan for these sites. And then we want to come back and see you guys all again one more time at some point in the fall. We haven't determined exactly when that'll be. That's when we'll have our final presentation where we share what we've come up with. In the meantime, the last slide I'll share with you guys, we're going to have lots of other inputs where you guys can take online surveys or attend pop-up events. There'll be other places and other inputs so that you can be involved even through the summer, even while we're doing our work and you're taking a break from the beach, right? So there'll be lots of opportunities for you guys to weigh in, which would be wonderful. We welcome you guys being as involved as you possibly can. Stakeholder sessions. So in mid-April, we had 5 separate sessions that were all kind of in the same week, but these were the groups that we met with. These were folks that we considered to be sort of stakeholders that had a little bit more of a vested interest in what we were doing. Not that the whole community's input wasn't important, but these were people with some real on-the-ground knowledge, with some history, the ones that are going to kind of feel the impact the most. First of which, we met with the Tea Time Committee, we met with the Recreation Department, and we met with the Council on Aging in a session. And the reason we met with all of them together is one of the major recommendations of the Tea Time Committee for the Tea Time site was a new community center. And the two primary tenants of that community center are going to be the Recreation Department and the Council on Aging. So we wanted to have all those folks in the room at the same time, because that's going to be its own sort of special problem to solve. And we wanted everybody to be hearing everybody else's needs and wants, so that we made sure we were doing something that made sense for everyone there. The next group we met with were the Town Center Plaza tenants. So that site already has 6 existing tenants. We wanted to talk to those 6 existing tenants and understand, how was the site functioning now? How wasn't it functioning now? What sort of needs or concerns do they have about this moving forward? The town is committed to continuing working with those tenants. The plan here isn't to sort of displace them and come up with something totally new. We want to make sure that whatever we come up with still provides a home for those 6 tenants. We don't want to lose the couple of great viable businesses we have going here already. That said, the third group were more broadly Eastham businesses outside of that particular parcel. That include the Chamber of Commerce and a number of other local businesses that, again, gave us a little bit of perspective of, hey, don't get too fixated on these 2 or 3 lots. We have some broader issues. How do these things all relate? How do we make sense of these sites in a way that creates opportunities for everyone? So we talked to them. The residential neighbors, these were the neighborhoods that are sort of immediately adjacent to these parcels. And so we had some conversations with those groups. Obviously, they had very specific concerns about, what am I going to be looking out at my backyard at? What am I going to be seeing? What am I going to be hearing? What's going to happen there? So we wanted to make sure we talked to them and understood what they were either worried about or excited about. And then last but not least, our fifth group was a smorgasbord of town board and committee chairs. So folks that were representing any number of different other committees and boards in the town, again, each with their own sort of individual focuses. But again, it was good to hear all of their input and for them each to hear each other's inputs too. I think the big theme here is we're trying to balance lots of competing, I shouldn't say interests, but hopes, a bunch of competing opportunities that folks want to see happen here. We're trying to make sense of all those things in a way that is hopefully the best case scenario for everybody involved. So some general takeaways from those sessions when we kind of looked at them all combined and everything we heard. In general, all of the groups support the Tea Time Committee's recommendations. We expected this. We knew it was built on a couple of years of experience. We gave those groups one last shot to say anything they missed, anything that you're worried about that is in there. And we didn't hear any of that. There was support across the board for those recommendations, and so that is exactly what we're using as our launch point. Find the right balance, what I was just suggesting. There's a lot of different things going on here. How much housing, how much community space, how much open space. That's sort of the challenge of our next couple of months, is finding that balance. We also want to build in some flexibility, both short-term and long-term. So in the short term, we don't know who's going to be building out this site, right? So we're coming up with a vision, but it needs to have a little bit of flexibility so that depending on what comes across the transom, you've got a way of making that fit and still respect what your ultimate goals are. There have been suggestions of things like a 50-meter pool. We don't know if we're going to be able to do a 50-meter pool, but we want to try to plan for that for as long as we can so that if it becomes real, we've got a spot for it. If it doesn't become real, we've got something else that makes sense in that sort of location. And even long-term, these sites will adapt over time like any place does. So how do we create a good, strong framework that over time can adapt as it needs to? Consider the 5 senses. Again, that's about sort of adjacencies. What are people going to see? What are they going to smell? What are they going to hear when they're sort of right next to these things? And so certain uses makes better sense in certain places than others. Traffic and Route 6 character are a major concern. We're all concerned about the character of Route 6, right? A lot of traffic, a lot of speed. The goal for these places are to be pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly. So we have to be very considerate about how we sort of treat those edges and think about those edges. And the town is also currently working on plans for sort of modifying Route 6. How can we calm it down? How can we make it work for us while also addressing needs like traffic and other safety concerns? So that's going to be an ongoing conversation through this. When we talk about open spaces, we want a variety of open spaces. It's not just to say we want, green lawns for every corner where we think we might have some open space. Some of those might be more formal, things like a formal lawn, like a town green, a playground, a pickleball court. But we might also have some open spaces that are much more informal, a little more natural, maybe food-growing forests or whatever the case might be. There's not a one-size-fit-all to open space, so we should be thinking about that as well. Whatever we do should have a village feel. So the point here is let's not propose a 10-story building. You know, what's going to feel appropriate for Eastham? What's going to feel like it's got a village character, a village feel that would be appropriate for this context? And again, remember that there are broader community impacts. Anything we do here has broader community impacts, and we want to make sure we're keeping track of those and being mindful of those. So again, these were some of the major themes that percolated out of those stakeholder sessions. We also wanted to share that there are a number of other efforts that the town is undertaking at the moment that influence or inform what we're working on. The Council on Aging is doing a building feasibility assessment, so looking at their current building facility. How is it working? How is it not working? What work might need to be done? We've talked about things if that wanted to convert to other uses, what might be feasible there. So that's underway at the moment. There's also a large-scale wastewater management project going on that's looking at the town comprehensively relative to wastewater. And this site factors into that. This site has been identified as one of the potential sites for wastewater recharge. We need to get a better sense of what that means, how much area that might take, what impact that might have on the programmatic elements we're looking to do. And conversely, the things that we come up with might inform that exercise and that study to understand what's feasible or viable or reasonable for this site. So that's happening at the moment as well. And lastly, as I mentioned, the Route 6 feasibility study, the efforts have begun there again to take a look at Route 6 and to think about sort of long-term how that can adapt or change or what that should look like. And so again, some of these things aren't going to be finished by the time we're even done, but we can help influence those studies or at least reflect those studies or build in that flexibility that we need depending on which way those go. All right, next up, design standards and program elements. One thing we did want to point out, there's been a lot of concern about sort of the character of this place and how is it going to look and do we need to create some standards, et cetera. The good news is that your zoning already has baked into it a fair number of design standards that we'll continue to respect, but that were written with a lot of these concerns in mind. How do we get a village character and scale? Some of those things are already addressed in the underlying zoning. So I think there's some concern that we might propose something that looks like it came from Mars, but that's not the intention, and that's not what the zoning suggests should be the intention. So that's all good news. In terms of some of the programmatic elements, one of the big ones is the community center. And we've had just some initial conversations about what that program might look like. We've started to get feedback, like I mentioned, from the rec department, from the COA, what their uses and things might be. And we also got input from the town that we should probably be thinking about something in the range of 20,000 to 30,000 square feet. That's probably a sort of reasonable size to imagine the town being able to afford with a lot of hard work, I'm sure. So we tried to look at for a couple of precedents that we might start to think about when we're starting to contemplate how a community center might work here. And we found two that seem to be pretty reasonable examples. One is in Harwich. This is a 32,000 square foot facility. As you can see, this is a sizable thing, right? This isn't a little tiny building that sits in the corner and somehow magically hosts lots of programs, lots of elements, different groups, a gymnasium, right? But some of these are the same programmatic elements we heard for the community center here in Eastham. So you got, this one has the Council on Aging as part of it. They have a full-size gym, activity rooms, game rooms. Again, some of the things that we talked about here as well. They don't have a separate teen space, which was something that was identified as a need here. But again, this just gave us a sense of the scale of what we're trying to start thinking about. Similarly, in Bourne, there's a community center, same size, very similar program. It's got the Council of Aging's offices there, gym, activity rooms, flexible spaces. Again, no separate teen space. But you'll see when I show you the concepts, we have this sort of bubble that says community center. We use these as sort of an example of getting our heads around how big is that bubble? Is that bubble half of the site, or is that bubble, this big on the site? So this just gave us a starting point, a reference point for those. One of the other big factors is going to be housing. We know that for a fact on tea time. We're considering it on the other sites as well. But when we say housing, housing comes in many shapes and sizes, and it's one of the other elements that we're going to kind of keep working through and talking about. We were fortunate to be here about 3 or 4 years ago doing a project with the Cape Cod Commission called Community Resiliency by Design. I don't know if any of you were involved with that. I got to be a part of that, and it was a really great process of trying to talk about the housing crisis that's on the Cape, right? There's an acute need for housing, and a lot of people assume that the best solution for that is to start building denser housing. But when we say denser housing, what do we mean? Does that have to mean huge format apartment buildings, the kind of things that were proposed on tea time that got everybody scared in the first place, right? And what we came up was this range of models that slot somewhere between a single-family home, like a lot of what Eastham is built out as, but without going to the extreme of having to say we're putting these huge apartment buildings here to try to solve this issue. And so we have these variety of house types. All of these have historic precedent. We found examples of these all over the Cape. At one end of the spectrum, you have cottages. The density is achieved by sort of clustering them in little cottage courts. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Then you could start combining single-family homes into things like duplexes, townhouses. As you work your way up this scale, you can get that many more units fitting onto a site. The manor houses and the walk-ups are both examples of small multifamily buildings. In the case of the manor house, that's like a 3 to 6 unit building that looks like a big house. That's why we call it a manor house. Technically multifamily, but very residential in scale. And the walk-ups are buildings, let's say, that are more like 6 to 12 units a building. Again, something that's the size of like a bed and breakfast, but not the size of a massive apartment building. So the point is, this is still something we need to, when we show housing and have a yellow bubble, we're going to have to figure out what's in that bubble on the sliding scale as well. And I will tell you that on a site like the Council on Aging, the answer is not going to be something on this end of the spectrum. But similarly, when we talk about the Tea Time property, I think if we had something that was more at this lower end of the spectrum, we're sort of not taking best advantage of that site. So again, housing might mean different things for these different sites, and we'll continue to work that through. We're also going to reference mixed use in a couple of the sites, and we want to make sure people understood what we meant by mixed use. A lot of great examples of these in a lot of the historic villages here on the Cape, right? Where you've got some commercial use on the ground floor, shops, restaurants, office spaces, and then above those, you usually have 1 or 2 stories of residential units. What I think the Tea Time Committee was calling top of shop, which is a cute phrase for the fact that there are units that are above the stores. So when we say mixed use, this is kind of the scale we're thinking about, village-scaled mixed-use structures. So smaller structures, with that commercial on the ground floor, some residential again above. And again, the amount of that, the scale of that, the quantity of that is one of the things we're going to be still trying to work our way through. And last but not least, open space. As I mentioned, open space can mean a number of different things, from something more formal, like a little hardscape plaza that's just set in front of some shops with just a little fountain and a place to gather. Something slightly less formal, a little bit more natural, more of like a town green, a town square, all the way out to something that's really fairly informal, fairly natural, but we might still have something like a trail in there, so it can still be utilized. So again, when we look at these things, we're going to be thinking about this as a sort of sliding scale as well. All right, so that was all the introduction, and now we're into the schemes, which you're actually here for. So for each of the 3 sites, I'm going to share with you guys 3 scenarios that we've come up with that we want to talk about. I'm going to present all 3, and then I'm going to put up a slide that has all 3 on there at the same time so you can remember what the options were. And at that point, we're going to start by doing a show of hands of sort of which ones you like, which ones you don't like. And I think we have the time, too, where I'd also like to open up to the audience if just a few folks could share why it is they thought option 1 was best, why it was they thought option 3 was best. Typically, I restrict your voting to 1 scheme, but tonight, I'm letting you guys vote for as many as you want. So if you love 2 out of the 3 schemes, raise your hand twice. If you love all 3, go for it. If you have a favorite, it is kind of helpful to know what the favorite is. One of the things we're trying to do here tonight is understand what direction do we want to go from here. If everybody in the room raises their hand for option 1, that's obviously pretty helpful for us. If we have an equal number of votes all the way across the board, that's also kind of helpful for us. That says, okay, we've got some options here. There doesn't seem to be one that's the clear-cut winner. So we'll go through that exercise for all 3 sites, like I said. So let's start with the Tea Time parcel. So these were the Tea Time Committee, their recommendations for this site. So this is what, again, we're using as our starting point for our efforts. Focus on a community center building that meets the needs of all ages of the community, anchored by the Rec Department and the Council on Aging, and that potential consideration of a 50-meter pool. So again, for the Tea Time site. Provide housing options to meet the need of those earning 80 to 150% of median income, and also reference the housing production plan. Include flex space that could be used for pop-up, startup businesses and food trucks. This site is zoned limited commercial, which means exactly that. There are only certain commercial uses that have been deemed appropriate for the site, but not all commercial uses. So there's also a little bit of a hiccup that because the town bought this from Stop and Shop said, don't put anything that looks like a Stop and Shop there. So we also have to be mindful, we can't just kind of put whatever we hope and dream for. We're not even sure we can propose a cafe because you can take out food from there. We're still trying to get some clarification on there. But again, the focus on the site is meant to be the community center and housing and open space, and we do think we should have some limited commercial here as well. At the very back of the site, if you're not aware, the Cape Cod Rail Trail literally touches the property. We want to take full advantage of that. That's a great access point to this site. Not everyone has to come in their car on Route 6, especially the local neighbors should be able to walk here, bike here, take full advantage of this from that side. We want to make those seamless connections. And in the end, we're trying to create a walkable downtown feel with an emphasis on pedestrians. So we have to be mindful of what we do with the cars. Where do the cars go? How do we wrangle them in? We know they're going to be here. I'm guessing most of you can't walk to this site, right? So you're going to drive to the site. We are aware of that. But how do we put the cars where they want to be so you park, you get out, and then you walk around and enjoy yourself? That's the goal here. I won't go through this in any detail. We've been reviewing the underlying the zoning. I will suggest that to the degree we can respect the underlying zoning, we will do so. I will also tell you in my 20-year career, I have yet to do a by right project. I always break some of the rules because that's how you get the best projects. And I think here we're going to be looking at that. Are there certain elements of that zoning that we might want to push back a little bit for? I will say anything that happens here would need a special permit in any case. So if we can break a few rules because they make sense, I think that's a viable thing that we could consider. So this is the site just overlaid with some of the constraints. You can see the setbacks are there in yellow. They're pretty minimal, so the setbacks themselves aren't necessarily a challenge. There is a 100-foot electrical easement running all along the back portion of the site. We can't build in an electrical easement, so that's effectively built-in open space. So we know we're going to have some amount of open space back there. And in some ways, that's good news. That's where we'd want it. That's where we are adjacent to the existing residential units that are just on the other side of the rail trail. On the other sides, we have commercial to the north, commercial to the south. Across the street is a mix, primarily residential, but they're on the other side of Route 6. So again, these were just sort of some of the things we were looking at to just understand the constraints of the site. Okay, so now it's time to talk about scenarios. So this is the first of the 3 scenarios. So again, this is not a literal site plan. This is a bubble diagram, as we often call it, just to start to understand where these various things might go on the site. And I'm going to walk you through this, okay? From Route 6, if we have a limited amount of commercial space, that's the place we think you should do it. It's got the visibility from Route 6 that helps keep those businesses viable. It's not great to have ground floor units on a busy road like Route 6, so that also means the housing wants to be upstairs, not necessarily on the first floor. And we think that could create that sort of village character right sort of out on Route 6. Not to say that all those things would have to face Route 6. We could turn things, we could be clever about things. But just in terms of appropriateness with an adjacency like Route 6, we thought that made some sense. The middle of the site is primarily housing. So that's what these larger yellow blobs are for. As I mentioned, somewhere on that sliding scale of the types we might consider here might be a mixture of those things. And interspersed within those, we think it would also be nice to have some of the more programmed open spaces, things like playgrounds, things like gardens that might be used by some of those residents. And in this particular scheme, what we're suggesting is maybe the community center is at the back of the site. It has the potential for the pool, and it has the adjacency to the sort of more informal open spaces, some of the more formal open spaces. It has access from the residential community beyond. So we think that the adjacency to those open spaces could be kind of nice. And it could also be kind of cool that you come here to go to the community center, so you actually sort of make your way through the site and utilize the whole thing, even if you're just there for the community center. That's the first option. Yes?
What's the difference between mixed-use parking and parking?
It's only meant to suggest that this parking that we would need to provide some level of parking for the uses up front. You could almost think of this as community center parking, that we would need to provide parking for the community center in the back. And like I said, I don't think in the end we want to literally have this one big chunk of parking. We will break that up, we'll intersperse it. We'll sort of set this up in blocks. That's why I worry about these diagrams, because they can suddenly you start thinking like, oh, these are like roads driving through here, and this is over here, and I come over there, and we're not quite there yet. We're still trying to understand where the pieces where it want to go.
Can you just find out where access from the road is going to be?
Where the access will be? To be determined. We know it'll be limited. We're not going to put 20 curb cuts here. We'll probably have 2 curb cuts here. If I had to guess, we'll have somewhere that you come in more on the southern end, probably somewhere you come in more on the northern end. So there's more than one point of access given the size of this site. But we aren't going to be coming in at more than 2 points, I would imagine. So let me keep going. Let me get through all 3 schemes, and we'll open it up. Option 2 still shows mixed use on Route 6, but you can see what we did is we pulled the community center forward. So the community center and the mixed use stuff can all sort of play nice together, which is, there's something nice about that. And we shift the housing further into the site on the back, where it probably makes some sense because it's adjacent to some of the adjacent residential uses here. And so again, you would come to the site, pass through the mixed use sort of zone, arrive at the community center, take advantage of the full site. So we think this could be kind of a nice option as well. And then the third option is we bring the community center all the way to the front of the site. Why not make that the thing that you see from Route 6, or one of the things you see from Route 6? It's meant to be a communal use. It's meant to be a community building. Why don't we put it in the most visible location we can? So I think there's a lot of sense about that as a potential option as well. If that's out on the main drag, we don't really need quite as much retail space to try to sort of hold that edge together, so there's a benefit potentially there as well. And then we could use a lot of the rest of the site for housing and open space. In this particular scheme, we didn't show a pool. One thing I will say is don't vote or not vote for the scheme because it does or doesn't have a pool. I think we'll still try to understand that in every one of these schemes, how we make that a viable option. But I think the point here is if the community center comes forward, we do a little bit less mixed use. We have a little more room potentially for something like housing or additional open space. Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick question. In all 3 schemes, is the number of dwelling units roughly the same, or is that to be determined?
That's also a little bit to be determined. We tried to keep them kind of equivalent. This one, certainly we gave a little bit more yellow blob, but like I said, it's because we took the pool out, and I don't want people to then vote for this one like, oh, this one's the most housing, so that's what I want. Really what we want you guys to think about is where does the community center want to be? Where does the housing want to be? Where does the open space want to be, right? So those are the kind of 3 things we were playing with. That's a big decision, right? Right out of the gate, if we know where the community center wants to go on the site, then we can sort of focus a little bit more on some of these other issues in a little more detail. So, lots of questions, yes?
Yeah, what proportion of the housing is going to be set aside for affordable housing? Isn't there some formula for that?
It's to be determined. I don't think there's necessarily a formula for that. I think it's one of the things we want to think through. We're going to see what is the appropriate amount of housing on the site. And then I think we can also talk a little bit then once we know how much there is, sort of what the tenure of that might be. If that makes sense.
So the town has just, announced this big, not contract, but agreement, with the Affordable Housing Trust and so forth. So I'm just wondering where they're going to put that.
So why don't we're going to have Lauren help out with questions at the end too. I don't know if you want to address that now, Lauren, or wait till the end. We can let some of these things.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
I just want to sort of emphasize what Jeremy's trying to say, that we're looking at very loose conceptual layout sorts of issues tonight. So we won't get into specifics as far as number of units of housing or how big the pool could be or how much square footage is going to be in the community center. So really try to think big picture, high level, conceptual, and the blobs, as Jeremy calls them, are really just a tool for you to start to imagine where do things need to go, what could the potential impacts of those sightings be on adjacent properties, on the uses within the site, and just sort of start to think about the layout and the composition sorts of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have a lot of these very detailed questions we do still need to answer. We get
Yeah,
that.
and
but
we are
we're
gonna
trying to take it
address
sort
them.
of one step at a time, because that's the only way. If we start at the really detailed stuff, you get totally bogged down. So it's just a process of slowly honing the focus into the thing that's right in front of you.
And we do have a microphone, which we've been asked by our lovely video services coordinator, Mike Cleary, because this is being recorded for later viewing. For those folks that can't make it tonight, we want to ask you that if you have a question, raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone. But why don't we let Jeremy get through the concepts, and then we can start to address some of the broader questions that you might have.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll let you take one more question, then we're going to move forward.
This is a broad question.
Yeah.
Did you offer any scenarios without a community center, or is that a done deal?
I think our understanding it's kind of a done deal, or certainly something we want to plan for. Like I mentioned with the flexibility piece, it might be that we do think about what if we don't get a community center, or what if there isn't a community center here for 20 years because it takes a while to raise the funds, right? I think we can think a little bit about that, like how would this maybe phase in or what the case might be. But I know one of the major underlying recommendations for this site was incorporate a community center, plan for a community center, Obviously, the town then still needs to figure out, can they deliver a community center? But I think for now, I think any scheme we develop will have a community center incorporated at this stage. So with that, let's move forward to all three schemes on the screen at the same time. Super exciting. So this is where I wanted to start getting your guys' input, and we wanted to put them all up so you could see them again, remember them again. Again, scenario one is up on the top left here. Community center a little further in, a fair amount of mixed use on the main street, housing in the middle. Scenario two, the community center becomes more central, the housing shifts back towards the port of the back of the site. Scenario three, community center comes all the way out to the street, leaving the back portion of the site more available for housing, open space, some of the other things we're talking about. So this is where I'm going to get a show of hands. Like I mentioned, you can vote for your favorite, you can vote for your two favorites, and if I will take a few minutes to ask a few folks if they're willing to share why it is they picked one versus the other. That would be great. So let's start. Yes, ma'am.
Just real quick, I think you said this before, but I want to be sure I understand that the size of the blobs isn't, the size of the blobs isn't so much what you're interested in, like the scenario three has more green than one and two. It's not that, it's more the positional of the different types of activities, is that right?
That's
So
correct.
we shouldn't worry about that.
Please try not to, as much as I know it's impossible not to. But as I pointed out, even here, we didn't show the pool just to remind ourselves to mention that there might not be a pool. But then by doing that, we gave ourselves more yellow, more green, is that, so anyways. Last question, then we're going to all vote.
Is this an indoor or an outdoor pool?
I'm not sure. Again, the recommendation was there's a need for a 50-meter pool in town. Some folks believe that, some don't. We know there's a challenge for the feasibility of providing pool or not. So again, that's right. I just want to emphasize, we don't know yet that answer. We will build in the flexibility for it, or if we find out 2 months from now that it's definitely in or definitely not in, we will move forward with that direction. But at the moment, we haven't been given a clear direction because we're trying to tackle X number of other issues at the moment.
Jeremy,
Yes.
just one more thing that might be helpful to people. Consider each of the blobs or the uses as separate projects, and each of those projects is going to require a certain amount of work and feasibility and due diligence and cost estimates and that sort of thing. And so the project as a whole is what we're looking at right now, the layout as a whole. And so each of those components will have to do more digging and more work on each one of those to really do them right. But this is about the layout of the site for tonight.
Okay, so now the only hands I want to see are everybody's hands voting. So let's start with scenario one. Who out there likes the idea of scenario one either the best or is one of the couple that they enjoy? I'm just going to roughly 1, 2, 3. Okay. How about scenario two? Lots of hands for scenario two. Great. How about scenario three? A couple hands for scenario three. So I think in summary, scenario two definitely got the most votes from the group. I think scenario one maybe had a handful more hands than scenario three. Show of hands, how many of you voted for more than one scenario? Okay, that's great. So of the folks that voted for scenario three, would one of you be willing to share what is you like about it? Back corner. And can we get the mic over there, please?
My concern, can you hear me?
I can.
My concern about the whole project is that it gives Eastham more visibility as a town. And I think having the community center and some businesses on Route 6 gives us the opportunity to do that, to bring people in, residents and also visitors.
Absolutely. And I do think there's something very wonderful about the community's building being one of the things that you see to define the character of the community. So I think that's great. How about one more person want to speak in support of that one? Yes, ma'am. Give her a sec with the microphone here.
So I live right there abutting the bike trail. So I want the open space there because I don't want cars on the top of my backyard and pickleball courts because those could be really loud.
Mm-hmm.
I like that there's more housing there and that Eastham needs housing.
Yep.
So I guess that's why I picked that.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's great.
Okay.
Great. All right. How about for scenario one? Is there anyone who put their hand up for scenario one that wants to share their thoughts? Yes, sir. Give her 1 sec here.
My first thought was about, oh, sorry.
No worries.
My first thought was about the community center being in a quiet space and being close to, you know, the bike path and stuff, and access for people. A lot of people use, I live on the bike path, and a lot of people use bikes to get around. And that was my first thought, but I do appreciate what you said. I mean, you live there, and I know pickleball courts and stuff can be loud, so. So there are a lot of, good luck.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, and I think even in a scenario, if we did do a community center towards the back, I think we would be mindful of not putting the pickleball courts at the back as well. You know, why we tried to show that there could be these other zones where we locate some of those uses, but totally understand that as an abutter, the more open space I can get there, the better, and then put some housing on the other side of it, because that's the most incompatible with what I've got. So definitely appreciate that input. Anybody else for scenario 1? We'll go here, since you're close.
I picked scenario 1 because the housing was not basically next to the bike path. One of those houses on the right-hand side is mine. I don't want 50 people walking down my street. And I don't know how many units you're going to have there, but I would like it more towards Route 6 than my house. That's about all I have to say.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so what? Certainly.
I take your point. That's why I voted for 3, because, I thought that was the least, I mean, I don't think the community center needs to be in a quiet space. People make noise there. And I think that is a good kind of advertisement, if you will, for the town. And that 3 provided, I think, the most, I mean, it looks like it's the most open space, which may or may not be true, but it provided like the most buffer to the neighbors, to the neighbors. I'm a neighbor as well. And it just, it provided housing in a good space, and it looks like maybe a little less commercial space, but again, we're not looking at that. So.
Okay. All right, because we do have 2 other sites to go to. I want to keep moving. So how about scenario 2, the one that got the most votes? Lauren, I'll let you pick out who you'd like to hand a mic to.
About site 2, I like the fact that the commercial is on Route 6, which is where it belongs, to attract more people and keep the businesses more viable. I like the location of the community center because it's off of Route 6. It's surrounded by some green, which is good for young people who are going to use it, for old people who are going to use it, and just as a scenic place to actually do community activities close to the center, but also on the green. I like the fact that parking seems to be less than certainly scenario 1, but also in very strategically planned locations. And I like the housing in the rear where it's going to be quiet. So I think scenario 2 is my choice.
That's great. Thank you.
I totally agree with the last speaker. With the businesses, you'll design something beautiful to put on the road. In scenario 3, you'd have to do the same thing with the Council on Aging or the
community.
The community center. You'd have to do the same thing on the front of that, which I think if you could use a space better, pushing it back, and you don't have to do something really fancy on the outside. But the businesses there get a lot more notification, and they'll do better, I think.
Okay. Let's do one more on scenario 2, just because it had so many hands when we showed it.
I'm looking at this from a long history here and a long history of in various towns going through planning. And one of the things that happens is that you affect everything else around it. So we're all looking here at just that. We're not looking at all the other businesses. We're not looking at the fact that we already have a building that is perfect for a community center, but somebody else owns it. And we'd have to decide whether that's something we want to try and buy, but it would be a whole lot less expensive, a whole lot of parking available, but it's not attached to this particular gold mine we have here that we're trying to fill. So I'm concerned, and I didn't hear anything in the introduction that talked about what does the business owner, we can put a business owner out very quickly by just having something terrific there. Everybody starts shopping in that direction. The next thing you know, people are saying, well, maybe we should have more of this, and it affects the other people. I think there's a lot of thinking and work. I'm so glad to see this, but I'd like to see that only with business people in here to see what does that do to them. Because if putting them out of business is not a really good idea.
No, sir, it's a great point. Again, we talked about sort of understanding those larger impacts, and I will use this as a segue to moving to the town center parcel. One of our marching orders there was to try to consider all 6 existing businesses there still being there. And one of the things, you wanted to say something before I say that?
I wanted to address briefly
Yeah.
that the question regarding what the businesses have said. We hold monthly sessions with our business community. We have held the dedicated stakeholder group session to get input, and that was very well attended. And so I think just to address your concern, there are ongoing communications with the business community. They have been in attendance at many of the meetings over the 2 years, in addition that the Tea Time Committee undertook of community engagement. So we are in close communication. I'm in close communication personally with many of them. And so we're including that input as part of the process, absolutely.
Yeah.
I just wanted to address that.
Yeah, and again, I will say that, the emphasis here is housing, the community center, the open space. I think the commercial is meant to just be a limited bit to support it, to be what's appropriate on that frontage. And the reason I was calling it a segue is because when we now shift to the town center site, one of the things we realized is if you have to keep everything that's there and yet do something else there, it's kind of hard to unlock the potential of the site. So one scenario we're thinking about is there a scenario where 1 or 2 of those existing businesses potentially come to this site? And that might open up some opportunities down there. So I think we aren't trying to propose any more retail space than is kind of already there in a way. I know that was one concern, that we don't want to, displace existing businesses, and the real market right now is for housing, not really for commercial space. But how do we make the most of the commercial space that we have available to us or that we think is viable or reasonable for this site? So, yes, sir. We'll do one more point and then we'll move to the next group.
Yeah, the one question that I'm wondering about all the parcels, is there going to be any way of any access other than right on Route 6? Because of the volume of traffic you're going to be dealing with no matter which scenario you have, you're going to be dumping it right on Route 6. And if there was another way to get back to Nauset Road, Brackett Road, or anything like that, I think that should be looked at, especially with what's going on across the street from this property.
Yeah, I think those bigger picture traffic issues are what we're counting on that other consultant to kind of work through. That's above my pay grade. Traffic engineers get the big bucks. We're just the architects, right? So I think we appreciate that is traffic it's always an issue. It's going to be an issue. How do we address that issue? I don't think we're going to propose we blow roads through and connect back to the residential community behind. I don't think that's necessarily the right solution. I think we need to lean on that rail trail to the best we can, make that feel like a great, wonderful connection off of the back. It's going to promote that many more people utilizing that as an option for getting here. I think that is about as much as I can do to try to sort of address the global issue of traffic in the town of Eastham. Is that fair, Lauren? Or?
I think it's fair, and I think I would just add that the work on Route 6 and the planning for any improvements along that corridor are going to be influenced by and simultaneously be influencing this project. So we do have an engineering consultant retained to support us in identifying improvements along Route 6, and we would be taking whatever plans come out of this process and using those to inform the roadway improvements that take place. So really trying to accommodate the uses that are and the layout that we settle on.
Absolutely. Great. All right, moving to the next site. Thank you, guys. This was the toughest one, I promise. So the next site is the Town Center Plaza. The Tea Time Committee recommendations were the 6 current businesses should be retained. That said, it'd be nice if we could create some additional retail, restaurant, and entrepreneurial space for opportunities for year-round residents. The idea of top-of-shop housing, that was that mixed-use idea, right? To the degree we can get some housing above those commercial spaces, that would be wonderful, because housing's a real need here. And similar to the Tea Time site, let's do so in a sort of walkable downtown village character sort of way that provides opportunities for outdoor dining, public transit improvements, pedestrian and bike safety improvements. Public transit improvement, that's on this one because there is a bus stop right in front of this site. And that's an important thing to consider and something we want to sort of elevate. Right now, it's hard to even know that there's a bus stop there. There's technically a little sign, but that's about it. So I think that's something important, again, when we talk about some of these traffic concerns. Could we get a few more people to hop on the bus because it's going to drop them right where they want to be, right? Again, the zoning, I won't go through this in great detail. The one challenge I will say is that we know that residential is a real need and something we really want to consider here. And you can see under not allowed, the very first one is residential uses. The exception up here somewhere is that you can do accessory residential uses, which means a little bit in addition to everything else that's out there. Earlier when I said I might be breaking a few of the rules about what goes where, this is probably one of those rules that I'm going to be leaning into breaking a little bit, is saying, let's find a way of getting some housing, some reasonable amount of housing on this site, not just some accessory use, but we got to keep talking that through and thinking that through. So again, this is the site. Again, the setbacks, you know, there's decent setbacks off of Route 6, but the rest aren't particularly challenging. The big challenge here, you know, if you thought the other site had adjacent residential, this has got people's backyards literally on that property line, right? So that adjacency is even more immediate. This site also has some interesting little built-in, there's an easement at this corner to allow this gas station to operate the way it needs to. They agreed to have an easement to come and go here. If they moved, it'd just all be too close and too dangerous. So we're going to be mindful and respectful of that and incorporate that. The bank in this location actually has a drive that comes through, and some of their parking is over here. So it's another opportunity when we talk about ways in and out. This site does have that opportunity to potentially, you know, connect in a couple of points when we sort of look it through. But those are sort of the unique challenges or constraints of this particular site. So the first scheme says we've got 6 existing tenants. I don't know if you guys can kind of see the footprints underneath of the image, right? There's some of the existing buildings. Here's one of the existing buildings. Here's one of the existing buildings. This one just tries to say, okay, what's the spirit of what we're trying to do here? We're trying to pull some of the buildings forward to create that village character, move the parking to the back. If we were to keep kind of the exact same 6 businesses exactly on this site and just move them forward, maybe incorporate some open space here, we could create a pretty nice little village, we'll call it a hamlet because it's pretty small at this point here. But we probably haven't really unlocked that housing potential yet. And that might be okay. It might be enough to just say, let's make sure that the 6 businesses that are out there today still get to stay on this site where they've been probably for quite some time in some cases. We've identified this one lower corner as what we're calling pad retail because we couldn't come up with a better term. If anyone's got one, I'll take it. The point here is that right next door we've got a gas station that has a very auto-centric use, cars coming and going. There's no changing the way that looks or feels or operates. But that also might create an opportunity that at that very first corner, we can do maybe a business that needs a little bit of that sort of auto-centric feel on that side, but on the other side could actually contribute to the sort of village scale and character. And one of the existing tenants, for instance, is a liquor store, and they've expressed a lot of concerns about, hey, our customers need to drive up. I don't usually leave a liquor store without a 50-pound box of booze with me, right? So I need to be pretty close to my car, right? So we got to figure these things out, and they're one of the things we need to consider here. And that's why we're calling it pad retail. Again, it's a terrible term. I just haven't come up with something better, but it really should just say sort of transitional retail. That's a very specific site that's got very specific challenges that we could use as an opportunity, help us transition in a comfortable way to the more walkable, villagey kind of scale thing we're trying to deliver behind. We also thought it was important to try to preserve, there is currently a little bit of an open space buffer here behind, I know it's hard to make out. The existing parking lot does something like this. Some of the dumpsters and things are sort of back in here for this retail. So there is a bit of an open space buffer that exists. The scheme says, let's preserve that to the best degree we can because those residents are right there. Option 2, which I'll tab back and forth so you can see they're pretty subtly, but they are different. The idea here is if we do want to introduce some top-of-shop housing, if we do want to add some residential units to this site, they're going to need some amount of that parking as well. So there might be a scenario where to get some housing to fit in addition to the retail, we might have to displace a little bit of that commercial space potentially to the Teen Time site. If I can have my cake and eat it too on this one and get it all to work out, that's something that we will work hard to do. We just recognize that when you've just got uses on the first floor, that only has that much parking. When you start layering more uses upstairs, you've got to figure out how you're layering in that additional parking. So this one's a subtle nuance, but it's why we're kind of introducing that thought that some commercial at the other site might unlock the ability to do some housing on this site. So we're trying to balance that and try to consider that trade-off. Otherwise, same ideas, right? Transitional retail here, the access points we have, the parking, the open space buffer in the back. So the final scheme is the one that kind of pushes the ideas a little bit further and says, what if we still do some amount of mixed use on the front street, but instead of having sort of an open space up front, we'll still make something really magical about the bus stop, but maybe we think of an open space that's a little bit more internal to the site. And maybe what we do is actually include housing, standalone housing, not top-of-shop housing, but this is, those townhouses, for instance, or those duplexes, or those, something along those lines that would be at the back portion of the site, as that instead of trying to do a buffer in front of a parking lot, maybe we put some additional homes adjacent to the other homes. So this one breaks the most rules. This one really rips the zoning sheet in half and says, let's come up with something better here, guys. But there's also a lot of trade-offs there. The folks that live there might say, actually, I'd rather have 20 feet of trees and a bunch of parked cars than somebody else's backyard right here. So that's a legitimate concern. But we do think housing adjacent to housing is often one of the best ways of thinking about it. But the trade-off here is we've got even less space available for the existing commercial spaces that are out there. So again, I think if we go this route, this is what I'm saying, they're all connected, right? We go one route on one site, we might need to think about a different route on the other site, or just making sure we're still addressing all of those total needs together. So I'll take a few questions before we jump to the voting. Yes, ma'am.
But then you also have the orange does continue to say mixed use. So in this scheme, it's possible to consider both ground floor commercial and residential above, in addition to the freestanding housing.
That's correct.
What you're saying with this
Yeah.
picture.
Yeah. But what that's really going to say is that the amount of that mixed use is going to keep getting kind of pinched down further and further. I still think we can get enough out there to still make it have the village character, to have a there, right? It's not just sort of one building in the corner. But when we start to pull even more uses onto the back portion of the site, it starts to kind of put some, you'll see we got rid of that open space buffer. We said we might need to really kind of put the housing, that's not to say the building's going to be right on the property line. They'd probably be their backyards in that same kind of zone, but that's right, so. Yes, sir.
In all three of your scenarios, your access to parking goes through the bank. I mean, I know we all use it, but is that really a viable pathway to access the property?
No. So this is another example of where I haven't shown the access points. That's what these blobs are, just that. It's not one continuous building that does that. We'd probably have other driveways, even in these housing, the yellow areas where we have housing. The parking for that housing is probably partially integrated into those zones. So you're correct. We would not do a scenario where it all has to come and go through the banks. I'm not even sure the bank would want us to do any access through there, although I think some amount of it's going to be a mutually beneficial thing to be able to have people come and go from both of those things. So, but we will be providing access. Like I said, if nothing else, we still have the shared access at this point here, and I can imagine we'll have at least one more access point off of Route 6 before all said and done. So, one more question, then we'll vote. Two-part question, all right.
So my first question is,
Sorry, this thing likes to go to sleep.
what's the purpose of the open space buffer zone on Route 6? That's one.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is, those businesses that are there now, I know that part of the negotiation was kind of an assurance, that they were going to be able to stay if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
Are any of these actually going to force them to have to move?
I don't think we would want to do anything that forces them to move. And that's why they were one of the stakeholders we met with. And we certainly got a sense from some of them, we're staying on this site. And there's also, like I said, some real constraints on the tea time parcel that we're still trying to clarify. I don't know if we can even put a restaurant that has takeout up there, because depending on how you read the fine print about Stop and Shop saying no food taken off premise, well, we think they meant Twinkies, but did they really mean the sandwich from the cafe place too? So we're trying to get that clarification. So any scenario we do will have to be respectful of the existing businesses and make sure they've got a place to go. I think some of the businesses that are there are a little bit more flexible, and certainly in our initial conversation with them, some of them seem to be open to the idea. They want to see a little bit more, they're interested in it. I will say, I think with all of these things, we're trying to get what your priorities are, what you're really attracted to. But like I said, if I can get all of it to work, I will try. If I can get all 6 businesses on here and housing above and housing in back and figure out how to park it all, we'll do it. But, you know, yeah.
Why do we need all that green space at this location?
In the front, again, it was meant to be a token representation of, there could be a little picture, one of those little smaller, like the fountain with the benches and the, right? So the scale of that is to be determined. I think that was also our shorthand for saying, let's make sure that I can't get it to leave, there we go. That the bus stop really feels like an integral part of what we do here. But the scale of that, the size of that, again, like all of these, try not to take it too literally. Sure.
In all of the housing bubbles that you showed, are you including the, you know, the necessary sanitation systems that have to go in? Are they included in your thinking of the space?
Yeah, we would certainly have to figure out how to address that. That's why we
that's
pay
gonna
John
be-
the big bucks and bring him along, because John's going to help us figure out where all that kind of stuff goes and is what we're proposing viable and what sort of systems would you need to use. Again, as I mentioned, even the town's comprehensive wastewater plan might come back and say, we need a big chunk of the back here to do some treatment. And John's going to help us negotiate that. What strategies are there to do that where it's the least impactful? So a lot of those real technical little things, we won't ever be designing a septic system out here, but John's going to keep me honest. John's going to say, you're pushing it, you need to set aside some more space for this, or if we go that route, we're going to need to provide this. So what we will propose will be mindful of those things. It might not be literal about those things, if that's fair. A bunch more questions. Let's do a show of hands and see if through that conversation your questions get addressed. But you're like, no way, I got to ask it right now. The difference between 1 and 2. 1 was purely commercial. Let's maximize the commercial space out there. That's what it is today. We know those guys all fit when it's purely commercial. Scheme 2 was, let's try to imagine there's some housing upstairs, even if that means we have to shift some commercial program to another site. It's a nuance, but that's what it was. Okay. All right, we're voting. We'll go in the reverse order this time. How about a show of hands for folks that prefer scenario 3 or like scenario 3 as one of their options? Okay, got a fair number of hands for that one. How about scenario 2? Decent number of hands for that one. How about scenario 1? Yep. So I think that's I think what we were expecting to hear. And like I said, I think now it's on us to try to work hard at understanding what is truly viable here. Can we get things to fit and also bring some of the housing to the site? I think to recap, the most hands were for number 3, because you guys are rebels like me. Number 2 is probably also pretty close, actually. So I think that the takeaway is, let's really try to make sure we've got something mixed use going on out here. But I think your concern is make sure the existing businesses have a place. Actually, we'll lead with you, because I'll take who voted for what. Why did you vote 1? Give it 1 sec for the mic. Lauren's getting her steps tonight.
I just like the idea of the existing commercial space of being, I think some of those people would be flexible if you gave them something better than what they already had.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can work out the housing thing on the other end, but I just like the idea of the open space in the back and the parking in the back, and what you've got to show is right up front. And if you're waiting for a bus, some of these bus stops don't even have a bench.
Yeah.
But let's make it a place where people want to go.
Yeah. Great. How about, we got hands up.
So I liked 3 best, and I wondered whether on that layout you could do less housing and have it adjacent to the commercial, like an L, and then you could have some more green space along the back that would make the other folks who live along there happier. Is there any reason why housing couldn't be connected to the commercial?
Not necessarily. Again, it's all us just finding that balance between how much parking we need, how much, I think, again, if I had my druthers, I would keep an open space buffer back there to the degree I can as I try to find that balance. And yeah, maybe we could displace some of it around. Probably, I think what you're saying is maybe the housing comes up sort of more into this zone, where it's not necessarily right behind the Cumbies and the bank, but it's got a little bit of separation there. So yeah, that's something we can certainly consider. Yes?
Excuse me, but I did come late, and I apologize for that. Tonight, are we going to talk about the Council on Aging space along with all of this?
Yep, it's the next one. If that's the one you're most concerned about, your timing's perfect. 'Cause
Well,
we haven't
it
gotten
is,
there yet.
but what I was thinking about, people that are living above commercial in these scenarios, tea time and this, where are their kids going to play? The ones that are living above, are you going to say, well, you can't stay up there if you have kids? They're going to be playing in the parking lot and in the stores and in the, you know, I mean, that's what I see. So I'm thinking the COA would be a great spot to put a bunch of housing, there's space, and kids could play. It's not on Route 6. And try to forget about housing right on Route 6. That's,
Yeah, no, I think one of the big challenges we've recognized on the Cape in general, but really in Eastham, so much of the existing housing stock in the broader community are single-family homes on individual lots, which set up great for families. But what we're lacking are other alternatives, places that you can live if you're single or you're a young couple or you're, an empty nester and don't need all this land kind of thing. So I don't think there's anything that would say you can't have kids and move into one of these homes. I would be surprised if you had mostly kids, but it's a viable point. And I don't think there's a way we would sort of steer that one way or the other. But those apartments, for instance, would probably be 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. They wouldn't be 3 and 4 bedroom apartments. So I don't imagine you're going to get big families attracted to these. Now, that all said, the reason it's called a housing crisis is because affordability is crazy, right? People are looking for anything they can afford. And that could be a legitimate pressure that you start to feel as that young working families, this is all I can afford, is this place that's here or there. But I think that's where we're hoping the Tea Time site will have a broader spectrum of opportunities for a broader type of households. This is probably a pretty specific user group for the couple of units that would potentially be here.
well, the other thing about that is, I've been to some of these meetings, and especially the pool, there was like four people who answered the survey that wanted a pool, and now it's like, we need a pool because these young families won't stay around if there's nothing, if they gotta go to the next town with their kids. Who's gonna be able to afford to live here, we're buying this, we're buying that, we're developing this. Now we're talking about wastewater. First it was just water, now it's wastewater. I mean, everything's brand new in the town, the schools, the libraries, who's gonna be able to, young people gonna be able to afford to pay the taxes here?
Yep.
I
No.
know old people like me aren't gonna.
Yeah, no, and you weren't here for the beginning, but I think one of the big themes of this thing is balance. What's the balance of all these competing needs? And everybody wants a pool, not everybody, but if we could have it all, we'd take it all, but we know we can't have it all. So we're trying to find what's the viable middle ground, or let's build in a little bit of flexibility depending on which way some of those conversations go. So.
Okay, I just want to put a plug in for scenario number 2 because I am a resident of the neighborhood that abuts that area, not directly, but I'm in that neighborhood, and I really would appreciate the green space buffer. I also appreciate the housing opportunity, so I'm just putting in a pitch for the green space buffer.
That's great. No, thank you. How about we get we'll get one more person speaking for 2 and one more person speaking for 3, and then we'll keep moving because I don't want to keep you guys here all night.
I preferred number 3, but my question is, since there's housing on 3, but not on 1 and 2, does housing on 3 mean less housing on the tea time?
I would say not necessarily. Yeah, I think the only thing, again, we need to be mindful of is the honest promise to make sure that the 6 businesses that are there today still have a home somewhere. So I think they're the only piece, and that's, in the grand scheme of things, a lesser piece than a lot of these other issues that we're talking about. So potentially, and that's the stuff that we're trying to consider and think about. So how about one last person for scenario 3? Back of the room, maybe. Oh.
I like scenario 3 only because it maximizes the amount of housing. We're in such a crisis for housing of all kinds, whether it's for seniors, people with disabilities, young families. It doesn't matter what it is. Any kind of housing is really going to help. So I like scenario 3.
Great. So I'm going to use that as actually, I'm going to let you speak real quick too before we go. One more in the back. And then I'm going to use that as my segue to go to site 3, where it's all about housing.
I support number 3, but I would like to just throw a concept out. At the town meeting, we just approved, I think we approved sort of permanent ability to have outdoor eating space. So given that we have a number of restaurants, it would be really interesting when you think about the open space, could there be some chance that businesses would have an orientation? They might have a main door, but they could also have courtyards that might meet each other. So there'd be a common space where outdoor dining and maybe some music or, you know, just a livelier space where there would be a common core.
I think that's a great suggestion. I think that speaks a little bit about the point about what's that open space by the commercial uses. It's not a playground. It's not a pickleball court. It probably is something more like outdoor seating for the businesses that are there. I think that's a great suggestion. So I'm going to transition to the last site to make sure we get through them all before we all start falling asleep here. Council on Aging. Tea time recommendations. Housing on the site should be consistent with the goals of the housing production plan. A public transit stop should be added on or near the site in coordination with Cape Cod Regional Transit Authority. Acknowledge and honor the history of the Eastham Senior Center and those key COA supporters and leaders who helped build it. So right in the first bullet, if you didn't pick up on it, they're already just assuming we're only talking about housing here. They're not suggesting this is a good location for commercial uses. You know, it's a limited site, so I think in some ways there'll be a little bit of open space built into it, but what's wonderful is right across the street, you've got acres of open space, right? This is a very different context with a very different set of constraints and opportunities. When we look at zoning, again, all that's really permitted here are 1 and 2 family dwellings. So it's intended to be residential. I think we're only thinking of it in terms of residential, with the exception of what's there today. There is a scenario where that might stay, right? Opportunities and constraints, the difference here, the site's getting smaller, the setbacks are getting bigger, right? So the buildable area is starting to look more and more constrained. But again, that's just because it's a very different context. It's a very different underlying zoning that we're considering. We also note that there is a paper street that runs sort of along the northern edge of this site. We're still working through clarification what we can or can't do with that paper street. It might be an opportunity for us to get access to a different point of the site than what the current access is on site. So again, we'll roll with that one as we learn more about it. So the first scenario is that the existing facility stays in place or maybe even expands a little bit if it needed to into a little bit more of its frontage, and you keep the large parking lot in back to serve its needs. This is a scenario where maybe the existing COA at the end of the day, we determine they're staying there. They're happy there. They want to stay there. I don't think that's the current thinking, but that's a possibility. Or that we convert it to sort of similar uses, like somebody mentioned respite care. If we could convert it to something a little more residential, but still serving a similar population, or any number of other uses that are sort of sympathetic with what it is currently. But again, it wouldn't become a dentist's office. It wouldn't become a realtor's office. It wouldn't become a cafe, right? So there is a scenario where it stays largely as it is today, and that's one of the scenarios. Scenario 2 is depending on how we repurpose that building. If there was an opportunity to do less parking out there today, part of the reason they have so much parking is because when they host an event or something, they might suddenly need it. I think my sense is that's a sort of limited thing, but I think the good news is if we had a new community center on the other parcel, even if the COA was still here in some limited capacity, wouldn't it be great if the events were actually happening over at the community center? That's kind of the intention for it. So there might be a scenario where that back parking lot becomes unnecessary and we could repurpose it for something else. And so thinking about housing, remember the sliding scale of types. One thought we had was at that lowest end of the spectrum, the cottages. Maybe this would be a really cool place to imagine doing a little cottage court back in there of some number of units. 8 to 12 we're talking about. We're not talking about hundreds, right? And if you don't know what we mean by a cottage court, you know, it really is these small cottages that are clustered around these sort of green spaces. 2 of these are projects we've done. This is in Concord, Massachusetts, called Riverwalk. This is Heritage Sands on Dennisport, one of Rob's projects. So the idea here is that you can cluster smaller cottages. As a result, you get higher density, but with a type that feels sympathetic in a single family sort of community, even though the numbers mathematically look a little bit higher. And so the thinking on this scheme was maybe we could put a cottage court behind the building. You probably wouldn't even really see it, right? It'd be back in there. And wouldn't it be great if maybe those were senior cottages because there were still some services being provided in the COA building where that's like a really great compatible use together. So if you were going to redevelop it as some housing, again, this requires a special permit. You know, it's zoned for 1 and 2 family dwellings. I don't think they were thinking about cottages, but that's something we would promote and try to work through. So that's scenario number 2. And then lastly, with scenario number 3, we said, what if at the end of the day we're not going to repurpose, the COA is moving out, the building isn't really feasible for any real use that makes any sense. Let's revert back to housing on the site. And one thought we had was you could still continue with the idea of a cottage court and back, but maybe at the street you could have 1 or 2 single-family homes, because that's what you would expect driving up and down the street, right? You're currently, it's just a bunch of beautiful single-family homes all the way down, so maybe there's another one here and there's another one here. Maybe it's a duplex instead of a single-family house. Maybe it's got an accessory dwelling unit behind it, so we're sneaking in a little bit of density, but still looking like single-family homes like you already have up and down that street. And those could work in conjunction with the cottage court behind it again as well. So you're having basically a new little residential community that from Nauset Road is just still looking like additional single-family homes. Now these lots would be too small for the zoning, so even this would require some level of special permit to happen. But we think this would be a really clever way of getting more housing on this site in a way that kind of fits the local context, right? We're not going crazy here. We're not proposing apartments on the site or anything. So that's what we're proposing for site number 3. So I'll take a few questions first, as we've been doing. Can you give her 1 sec with the microphone?
Could you go back to scenario 2 for a minute?
Want to put up all 3? That's a good idea.
No, this is a question. Oh, well, but I can't read anything now, so.
Oh. You should have come up front with all these great seats.
Just go to scenario 2 for my quick question.
Yes, will do.
So it says reuse existing building COA respite care.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you reuse the existing building for live-in respite care?
Maybe, not necessarily. It was sort of, maybe COA stays there but doesn't need as much space, or if they want to leave there but the building's in great shape, maybe we repurpose it for something. Respite care was a suggestion from one of the stakeholder sessions, so we just kind of put it on here to try to suggest there's a couple of ways that could go, but you obviously have feelings, so let's hear what you're thinking
Well,
about here.
I mean, I thought that was a brilliant idea because as we get older, and I'm only 19, so this doesn't affect me, but we need help, and the housing is getting outrageous, so it's not as if my home health aide is going to be my neighbor next door.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have elderly people in the cottage court, and you have a facility right there that is geared up to assist old people, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So if I vote for scenario 2, am I voting for old people?
Maybe.
Yeah, 19 and over, thank you.
Yeah, 19 and over. I like that answer. Yeah.
I think that would be a safe bet, that 1 and 2 retain the site as a more older-focused site. Well, we have to talk about what that little darker yellow bubble could be. It could be congregate living, it could be, COA board members have suggested a human service type of thing, so we don't know yet, but you're right, it's headed towards that direction.
An amenity space of some kind for the cottage colony was something we threw around, so there's lots of options.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of questions. One is there someone here that knows whether a survey has been done of the people who who use the COA and what their preference is? I saw that there was a note about respecting those folks. That's one question.
Mm-hmm.
So we did 2. We did the Tea Time survey, which surveyed a lot of people. And right now, the COA is doing their strategic planning process, which will include a survey, which Dorothy is going out June. Okay? So we'll have a lot of data to work with, and we just finished a whole look at the building. So we're going to collect a lot of stuff, and then we have a lot of talking and considering to do.
Mm-hmm.
Just quickly on that note, if the people who use that facility on a regular basis want to stay there, will that be respected and taken into consideration? Secondly, that parking lot that is back there, we were just over there the other day, that looks like, but there's probably some zoning that would prohibit it. More than little cottages, I would think seniors like myself are in a better situation to be able to use something like apartments rather than little individual cottages. I mean, it's a little more companionable with your neighbors right next door, and I like the connection with the COA being there, but I really feel that the active users of the COA, their thoughts should be really considered heavily in how this goes.
Yeah, they definitely will be. That's, as Jackie mentioned, part of the process, and it's a parallel effort alongside this. Similar to the Route 6, they'll inform one another.
So I'm going to jump to the voting because we're getting close to 7, which is what I was sort of targeting in my own head, at least, of trying to be a reasonable time to keep you
That was what we
until-
advertised, Jeremy.
That's what we advertised. So I'm thrilled that I look over and still had 8 minutes to go. I assumed it was probably like 8:30 already. So, and I know this one's a bit of a trick question, right? Because a lot of it depends on what we end up doing with the COA. So I get that. It's a little bit of a different beast when we're looking at this one. But again, so maybe just vote on sort of what you wish it would be, right? Like that's kind of where we're at. I guess the other thing would also be if you hate the idea of a cottage court, right, or something more on there. Scenario 1 obviously suggests that we aren't really adding much more there. So there's an option there, I guess, if that's sort of the direction you're leaning. But again, every one of these sites is a little different, right, if you haven't figured that out by now. It's a different set of challenges kind of on each one, but we're trying to solve that equation simultaneously, which is both fun and challenging. So I'm going to jump to the 3 options on the screen. And so let's do show of hands here. Scenario 1, any takers for scenario 1, which is up top. That's the sort of, the building is as it is, maybe expanded, the parking behind, kind of as it is now, sort of in any direction that it might go. No takers. Wow, that's exciting. Okay. Let's go to scenario number 2, which was maybe the existing facilities is still in front. We've got a cottage court in back. We've got a big show of hands from the 19 and over crowd in the back. More hands are coming up. It's great. A lot of people going for scenario 2. Okay. And how about scenario 3? Okay, a fair number of support for that too, which is good. Because again, I think we're going to find out through this process what is realistic or feasible for that structure. Yes?
Being as I'm 19, my ability to get in and out of the tea time space if the COA was moved is kind of a frightening concept. The nice thing about this for everybody this age is going in and out on Nauset Road is quite relaxing, even in the dead of summer.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody leaving the COA on 6 will have to make the right turn, until they can get to a light. And I think that might be a very important dynamic for all those people 19 and over.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a fair point.
This gentleman on the other side's had his hand up, so I'm going to come to you, sir.
Thank you. This has been very, very helpful and informative. I'm going, because we're near the end, I just want to make there's 2 points. One is, I would urge you, if you haven't already, particularly the town people, to somehow corral young adults who have a home here, who will probably be living here in 15 years as stakeholders. I know it's probably difficult to gather that population, but I think it would be very helpful in the future that they had a piece in the program, that they could take ownership and some commitment with it.
Yeah.
The other is just, I just always have felt it's just too bad we can't have a bridge between here, this part of town, and what is emerging there.
Mm-hmm.
So just again, maybe some thought for the town. The town green as a gathering place, maybe we could buy some property for an ice cream shop and a coffee shop that would draw people there on a more regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, those are just
a
couple of dreams.
That's great observations. A few hands behind.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted 2 things. I just wanted to say thank you very much for everybody coming out. It's a great show of the townspeople. The Tea Time Committee, we had met, and I assume most of you had an opportunity to fill out the survey. But in addition to the 2,400 surveys that were completed, we did have about 50 different meetings of this type. And I think that overall, the concepts that were presented really did reflect our committee representation of what the people in town wanted for that. And I just wanted to hit the one point. We made an extra effort on many occasions to get young people involved in the survey. Lauren did an unbelievable job of reaching out. We did some roundtables with the young people. We, reached out to the parents of the elementary school, the middle school, so on and so forth. So we really, really feel like we got them this time. And we were able to get all areas of, the community, from young people like this 19-year-old over here but everybody else in between. So I really feel like, and I think you're off to a good start with this. I was very pleased for tonight.
So we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to just get to my last couple slides. I'm happy to stick around and keep talking. Again, I'm just trying to be mindful of the time. And it was also a good segue to say that we do have a number of steps ahead of us. That participation, you're correct. We're trying to figure out, it's a challenge with any project we have. The young folks that have kids and it's like trying to get them out and get them focused and get them interested, short of doing TikTok dances, I haven't quite figured out yet. So we're trying to get there, but this is just the first of a couple of public presentations. So by all means, please tell your friends, tell your families, try to get anybody you can to sort of either attend these or participate in whatever way they're able to. So we'll have the 3 presentations I already mentioned. Lauren is also trying to set up an event out on the Tea Time site for the end of June, or at least that was the target, still is the target. Put it out on the site, people driving by and going, what's going on here? And we're hoping that will be a draw for some people, certainly that live in the area, drive by that area, and see the site all the time, to maybe pull them in and get them involved. There was a discussion about having a meeting specifically with part-time residents, right? We know that Eastham is a community that isn't only year-round residents. There's actually a number of part-time residents too that are an important aspect of the community. We should share with them what's going on, maybe try to get some input from them as well to see how that might influence some of these things. Again, I think the underlying theme of this is the year-round residents, or who are really here. This isn't meant to be a tourist destination. We haven't been using any of those kind of terms, right? There's not a water park being proposed here. We're trying to really make this something that's for the residents that live here year-round. And there might be other pop-up events. We might try to do a few boards in the library at some point just for people that come and go to see something. We're still trying to brainstorm a few other ways of doing it. But I will say that for everything we do, we're going to try to get everybody's focus to go to that last line there, northeastham.masterplan.com. That's where we're going to put the latest information we've got. That's where we're going to post links to surveys. One really cool thing for you guys that came out tonight, not only did you get to vote with your hands, but you're allowed to also take the online survey that's going to ask the same series of questions. You get to vote twice. How un-American is that? So you can go onto that survey, and everything you've shared with us tonight, please do it on there. Again, it reinforces those points. It helps us really, truly capture that. And again, get the word out. It's a fairly quick exercise. We've got a little bit of background in there, so even if you weren't at this presentation, folks kind of read, oh, I see what they're asking me to try to do here. We want to get as much of that input as we can from as many different segments of the population here as we can. And like I said, all future things, like when those pop-up things get scheduled, or when we make the final presentation date final, the website is the place we'll try to put all that information. That's also not to say that Lauren isn't always available too. If you've got questions, and can reach out to her. She loves lots of calls.
We have a Facebook page too, which many of you may have heard about this event through. So I think it's actually Eastham Master Plan, because North Eastham Master Plan wasn't available. I don't know who grabbed that, but someone did. It wasn't us. So that's a fun fact.
yeah, exactly. So again, we're hoping there's plenty of opportunities ahead as well. We're just sort of I'd say we're just getting going, but that's really, I'm just getting going. You guys have obviously been at this for a couple of years now. Again, I want to take a second to thank the Tea Time Committee again for really exemplary work. All the work they've done so far, that's a lot of public input. That's a lot more than we're usually able to get with these sorts of projects. So we feel like we really are at a really great starting point for this. So with that, I'm happy to take a few more general questions or inputs, and we'll try to wrap it up here soon. Thank you. So on your way out, if you're heading out, if you haven't done the little paper survey we had people do at the beginning, there's probably a few more back there. If you didn't sign up, please sign up. There's also a really pretty flyer that's just going to remind you of the website and some other things on your way out. And I guess if you have ever thoughts or questions, come on up and we'll talk.
There are flyers for the next workshop at the back of the room, please. As John has them, he's waving them. Thank you all for coming.